Casey Turbin here of Addressing Winchester, here with your fourth and final of the Winchester Black History Profiles for Black History Month 2024. Now, since all the local public history entities are doing an excellent job sharing individual stories of excellence and triumph, I thought it would be prudent to pivot towards a pair of videos on emancipation and parts of Reconstruction in the Lower Valley. So this video pairs with part 3 if you haven't had a chance to view the story of Robert Milroy's Freedom to Slaves order in January of 1863. Make sure you go back and do that. But today we pick up with Reconstruction in the aftermath of the war in one of the most ravaged areas of the country in the wake of the conflict. Now, hopefully this is the first and last time there is any sort of disclaimer here at Addressing Winchester when it comes to talking race in the South, but you must strip politics and modern conceptions out of your head when considering the motives and actions of players in any historical era. Winchester was a strongly Confederate town, as well as the entire valley. In the wake of defeat, the people of the former Confederacy were tasked with survival. Some of them walked and used federal passes to find themselves home, most several hundred, maybe even 1,000 miles from the killing fields of the valley in Virginia. But for the residents of Winchester and the Shenandoah, there was nowhere to escape by train or by foot. Home was the remnant of a literal hell that informed their feelings towards the federal government in memory of the war, even to today. There is no doubt the circumstances of the newly freed or never enslaved being extended a cautious personhood, and a vote from Washington had greater fears and harm over them from minute to minute or hour to hour in this tenuous period of history. But themes like tragedy, triumph, fear, and security were not colorless or confined to points below the Mason-Dixon. Racial violence and tensions were inflamed in all points from Boston to Birmingham. It is the goal of good scholarship to extract out of the nuance and select the stories that make our local history local, even if sometimes those things offend your modern sensibilities. You can't study the Valley without studying Confederates, and you can't honestly tell the story of the war without slavery and race central to the tale. Reconstruction is complicated. Many of the dates and concepts are still debated among scholars today. For the sake of the video being concise and on topic, today's video will focus on the Freedmen's Bureau and education in the Valley, but by no means should your study on Reconstruction stop there. Now, Reconstruction is the period after the surrender of the Southern armies and generally considered to end with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876, which led to a deal that ended the military occupation of the states of the former Confederacy by federal troops. Now, as neat and tidy as elections and laws are, for many blacks in the Shenandoah Valley, the first act of Reconstruction was an act of bravery by fleeing to a Union army, which by the end of the war was operating as a tool of abolition. In the first few months after the war, the situation had become rather perilous for the newly freed. In a message to the Union General Alfred T.A. Torbert from General Isaac Duval, as quoted by Jonathan Noyalis in the 2021 book Freedom and Slavery in the Shenandoah Valley in the Civil War Era, the concerned general pled to his superior. The condition of the Negro families in this vicinity is, in my opinion, becoming alarming. Large families of women and children are now roaming over the country, destitute and almost naked. I deem this a matter of vast importance to the community, as large, and earnestly recommend immediate action. Now, Duval's concerns were passed to the newly formed Freedmen's Bureau, full name the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, led by Oliver Otis Howard, a name that should ring familiar to all of our Addressing Gettysburg fans. Now, the job of the Bureau was impossible for a multitude of reasons. Underfunded and operating essentially as an occupying military organization in former enemy territory, there were few allies for the work that Howard and his primary adjunct in Virginia, Colonel Orlando Brown, were doing. Brown had served in the Civil War as a surgeon and quartermaster, but left those positions to command the 24th U.S. Colored Troops Regiment at a time when white officers often balked and passed command over black units because they saw it as a lesser promotion. Being a master organizer, Brown was quick to divide Virginia into 10 administrative districts, Winchester and the Valley falling in the 6th district. Brown's response to the Valley's failures to usher in emancipation with open arms was to, at a minimum, make sure that the newly freed had somewhere to live, even if that meant living with their former owners. He suggested that by military might, the Valley's residents and former enslavers should house, provide, and protect the newly free. One can only imagine how quickly tension rose over every morsel of much-needed food and protection in the new social order. Now, as with all points in the South, former Confederates sought to preserve their new view of order with terror groups like the KKK. The Shenandoah Valley was no different. The historical record is full of extra-legal and paramilitary attempts to subvert the work of the Bureau, and by 1868, agents were using the Ku Klux Klan by name when describing disturbances in the Valley. Now, in the struggle for equality, there is perhaps no tool more powerful and sought after by the free and poor alike than education. A free and accessible public education became the most viable manifestation of the Bureau's work with the creation of schools. Oftentimes, the most dangerous job in the Bureau's mission was not as a soldier or federal agent, but as the lowly schoolmaster called to educate the newly freed. The biggest target of vigilante justice and intimidation would be those often kind-hearted Northern educators who were used to teaching classrooms with black students. There are numerous stories like that of G.H. Harrison, a teacher of a school in Massanutten that was pulled out of bed at gunpoint by a dozen men and essentially waterboarded in the Shenandoah River in the winter of 1866 for having the gall to teach the dark-skinned. Even women teachers were not immune to mob rage and fears stoked in the Valley, as a woman who opened a night school for the colored was cornered and intimidated by a mob in Berkeley County just a couple years later in 1868. Now, there is perhaps no educational institution in the area more famous to emerge to serve the call for black education than Harper's Ferry Store College. The college began as one of those one-room educational ventures oversaw by the Freedmen's Bureau and shines as exactly as what cooperation between locals and Northerners concerned with the future of the black experience in the post-Civil War South could achieve. The first class of the institution will be taught under the direction of Reverend Nathan Cook Brackett and saw 19 formerly enslaved children begin their formal education. By 1867, Brackett, with the help of the New England Free Baptists, would pair money they raised with a $10,000 grant from Maine businessman John Storr to give the school its permanent name and funds to become the area's premier black institution. In the shadow of where John Brown sought to incite a slave rebellion, black excellence could be cultivated and dispersed. But just like the secret classrooms up the valley, even Storr wasn't exempt from extra-legal violence and paramilitarism. Even into the 20th century, a history with race and identity in John Brown's Harper's Ferry that this short video cannot even begin to address. In the end, congressional Reconstruction began, and by 1870, federal troops had been pulled out of Virginia, the Freedmen's Bureau offices were closed, and the Civil War era subsided as participants, its veterans, and their children rebuilt and realigned in a new South, in a new Virginia, that would see the Shenandoah Valley become known best for its premier turnpike, its industry, and natural wonder as means of tourist attraction, rather than for its role feeding and fighting for the Confederacy. Out of that new age, familiar local black heroes and families like the Briscoe family of doctors, jazzman John Kirby, and the baseball star Spotswood Poles would be able to thrive, when before they wouldn't even have been allowed to learn. Now, thanks for joining me on the fourth and final Winchester Black History Profile. Please like and subscribe. Next month, I'll be putting out videos about local history topics all out of the Civil War era, including a trip where I dragged my wife and son down to Cowpen, South Carolina, where our beloved Daniel Morgan whooped the terrible, bloody Bannister Tarleton and proved, while many historians call Morgan the only original military mind of the Revolution. I'll see you then.